Hi, I'm Author Assist, proud sponsor of the 3-act structure show on the GoIndieNow platform. Author Assist offers affordable services and one-on-one training to independent authors. I help them from brainstorming an idea to publishing and the promotion and marketing of the book. I have 2 podcasts, Narrations by KK and Behind the Pen. I'm the host of the radio show Author Assist on the Artist First Radio Network, and I'm also a multi-award winning filmmaker. Love creating book trailers. I'm also a graphic designer and offer at least another 20 services that will help authors navigate and stand out. If you're a new author and you're holding the copy of your book in your hands, thinking, now what? That's when you need Author Assist. Contact me for a service sheet at kgantusauthораssist@gmail.com.
When we deconstruct the elements of story and its structure, whether you acknowledge 3 acts or not, our focus shifts to one aspect that connects us all, the characters. Since the dawn of storytelling itself, there has always been one side's hero and one side's villain. Now, where you may fall in who you support or relate to might shift, but it's always there. However, these days, it's even more layered and complicated. When we have been able to nuance and finite roles and involvement, gray the black and white. It's that examination we will be doing this season. And we'll be doing it in 3-act structure.
They explain the unexplainable. They are those entities that change themselves and everyone around them. Whether it's through love, lust, hate, or just through nature itself, they are more than just from beyond. They are here, and we see them. Those paranormal entities.
Hey guys, I'm Madeline Dale. I write fantasy, paranormal, romance, adventure, kind of all mixed together. I have books published widely, and you can find all my work at my website, thechaptergoddess.com.
Hi, I'm Lily Lucchesi. I am the USA Today bestselling author of horror, urban fantasy, and paranormal fiction, and I am also the co-founder and editor at Partners in Crime Book Services.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Kinsella. I am the author of the science fiction novel The Lazarus Taxa. My book's available on Amazon, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble.
I am Elle Bachman, and I write horror and dark fantasy. I am the host of the Dark Jottercast and the co-host of the Pajama People podcast, which is with writer J.K. Allen.
Hey, my name is Vanessa Junta. I am the author of the Soul Cavern series, which is an urban fantasy series that I call my Vampire Not Vampire series. I'm also a freelance editor, and I run the online Facebook writerly support group called The Writing Tribe.
With this character arc, right, you have to decide, is it going to be a real world that you're working within or a fake world that you're working within?
I always prefer making them as realistic as possible because, I'm one of the people of the mind that I do believe in ghosts, and I do believe that a lot of the things probably existed at some point in time. So I enjoy putting it into the real world, whereas I then go and make up a history for them. How do they exist in this world? And I feel that's very difficult to keep it realistic and keep it believable. But that's what I want to do, is I want my readers to go in and, hey, this is our boring normal world, but look at it now. Look at what's in it. Look at what I put there.
I agree with Lily. Because when a reader goes into reading your book, it's new for them. So what I've always done that works for me is start with something realistic. So the reader can relate to it, and then you start bringing that stuff in slowly. Like with the series, like you mentioned, Maxwell Demon, it's the Blasphemer series. I introduced this world with characters like Dante, which shows up in book 2, where he's not aware of this world that has all of the entities in it. So I figured that that would work best for a reader to be introduced like Dante's being introduced. So there is a balance that needs to be done, because you got to remember, well, at least I have to remember when I'm writing these things, that the character started off not knowing, just like the reader would start off not knowing. So there is a balance that must be done. Like Lily, I am somebody that believes in a lot of things. That's some of what I talk about on the Dark Jottercast podcast, is kind of delving into the background of paranormal entities, and, you know, is it a rumor? Was it something that was made up? So I with all that I know, it makes sense to start with realism and then slowly introduce those things.
I think it very much depends on which sort of paranormal entity you would like to incorporate. I have kind of rough horror drafts which land in both camps. I find the not real setting to potentially be more interesting, just because you don't see it done as often. But that world, you know, this fantasy world that you create, it has to fit the entity you're looking for. I think from a horror thing, you need to consider what makes it frightening, and quite often a world which is without some of our modern comforts makes whatever antagonist we have in place more frightening, so it can be heightened, but it can be more difficult to do because you have to build that world as well. The reader just doesn't just know.
I agree with Lindsay. It definitely depends on where you're going. It depends on your genre too, you know, because if you're writing urban fantasy, well, yeah, it's gonna be in the real world, at least, you know, partially. Whereas something like horror can go either way. I'm currently working on a horror novella set in an abandoned carnival, and it phases in and out of between our world and basically an eldritch world. So like there's an entire world that the characters are going to be thrown into that has no frame for which they have no frame of reference for anything that's happening.
I have to say I kind of like the whole concept of using the real world too to pull them in, because in my Face Shifter series, I bring in skinwalkers, which is kind of an older Native American thing, and there's different varieties of them. But in order for my main character, Liz, to access the powers that kind of go with her bloodline with them, she has to get in contact with all the spirits of her ancestors. And she's kind of blended into this crazy world, and all this power comes rushing in. And it's really cool because Native Americans believe that kind of stuff can happen. And I mean, I wouldn't say the power could totally happen, but I don't think it could in real life. But still, I try to bring like some of that belief system in with those characters.
I think part of why I'm drawn so much to urban fantasy is because I want some of this stuff to actually be real in our world. So I like to write characters that I identify with so that I can kind of experience something I think would be really cool, even though it couldn't possibly actually happen. So it's kind of a way of like, I don't know, like self-brainwashing or something.
That was the entire reason I wrote my first book, Stakeout, was I wanted to live in that world. I wanted to be Angelica Cross. I wanted it to be real. I wanted, because it's set, you know, in Chicago where I'm from. I wanted to walk outside and be like, yes, this is the cool world,
Yes.
not this boring one.
So if you're going to place importance on, you know, whether it's real or not real, I would assume that with these character arcs, there's a lot more focus on making sure that you're following the elements and rules that these entities are bound by. Am I wrong in that? Is that a misconception, or do you think that?
I think it depends, because we don't know. Like, we only know what we hear, right? And like another example, the Vela project that I'm in the midst of posting, the book is done. It's about a pair of 12-year-old twins who discover they are the guardians of Pandora's box through their matriarchal bloodline. But we all kind of know the main idea behind that. But if you go and delve into the Pandora's box myth, there are multiple different things. There are multiple stories. There are multiple ideas of where the box came from or what's in the box. I think that it needs to be recognizable. But so much of what we do, like if you look at vampire lore, we know what our modern vampires, like what we believe as far as modern vampires, but every society had some sort of a vampiric creature in their lore, and they're all different. So I think you have to make sure that what you're writing makes sense. You know, your paranormal entity makes sense within the world, that it plays by the rules of the world that you have set. But I also think that a big part of what makes stuff like this interesting is how you can, turn it and like flip it over and make it something entirely new while still being familiar.
Yeah, and also building on that, how there are so many different things. I love to combine them. That's one of my favorite things. I also love to kind of twist them, because a lot of recent books consider werewolf shapeshifters. I don't. In my world, as you learn in the Paige Papillon novels, especially in book 3, werewolves and shifters are two entirely different species. Shapeshifters are natural. They were born, they evolved, whereas werewolves were created via dark magic. And I actually wrote the werewolf myth in the first 3 books. You see it discovered by the villain in Paranormal Detective series. So that ties in that way. And I think that, when following rules, the first thing you need to remember is that rules are made to be broken, and many rules are very malleable.
And I like that there's a distinguished thing, because people look at me when I'm crazy when I say, no, they're not werewolves, they're shifters. Like, that's different. Like, that's not the same.
Right. And werewolves are only wolf-like, whereas shapeshifters, I have a cat shifter, I have a fox shifter.
When we talk about kind of rules and what our kind of confines aren't necessarily rules that pre-existed. I think that they're entirely open to change. I think that you can take folklore, you can bend it, you can break it, you can turn it into something entirely new. But I think what's important is that you have to then create your own rules, and I think you have to broadly stick to those, or if you don't, it has to be for a reason. Perhaps there's a twist which involves a difference in that set of rules.
For me, when I go to write anything, where it's whether it's like a human person or a shifter or whatever, I have to make sense to me in order for me to write it properly for a reader. I do delve more into that world from the Blasphemer series and explain like the vampires and the werewolves, and how even in the werewolf world, there's like almost a subculture where there are shifters, where they could shift into a werewolf. I also kind of explained a background of where werewolves were one defined thing, and because of there's always werewolves and battling with vampires, that the vampires want to kill them off, but I still wanted them in the book, so I had to kind of come up with a new origin. So I think there has to, at least for me, to write in place. But it's true, rules are made to be broken, especially in writing. That's what makes it so fun.
The other thing about this kind of character arc that I think is very interesting is I'm not sure you can get away with just putting a ghost in a story and going, hey, here's a ghost, or here's a werewolf. I think this arc in particular, no matter what kind of character it is, whether it is, tertiary, whether it is the antagonist, the protagonist, whether it's the love interest, especially if it's the love interest, but any interest of any arc that you can think of, there has to be some kind of origin or some kind of explanation behind it a little bit, doesn't there? Do you feel like this character needs a little bit more backstory than any other character you might present in the story, because we have to understand it and know what it is? Or is there another reason why?
I think that's also genre subjective. I think in a lot of high fantasy, a lot of people can get away with their creatures just existing because, just like humans just exist, so they don't have to do an explanation. I prefer it if they do as a reader because I don't write high fantasy, but in paranormal and urban fantasy and horror, I think the reasons why they exist and how they exist and I think they're very important. Whether it's a series or a standalone, but especially a series, backstory and world building is extremely important, and it's vital that you don't skip that too much. And again, if it's a series, it's also better if you reveal it slowly. I think those things can be great plot twists. One of the things that I did in the Paranormal Detective series was Angelica actually didn't know vampires' whole history. And when book 4 comes, the plot twist that comes involves her directly. And she had no idea about any of it. So I think that if you world build slowly, especially over a series, it makes the paranormal world and the paranormal entities themselves much more interesting and much more complex to the readers.
I'm going to jump on that because, yeah, I totally agree with that. And I actually gave mine. So I didn't intend to do this with my book series, but with the Skinwalkers, I kind of made up an origin story where they tied back to the very beginning of creation. And I utilized like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and all of them and kind of spun it off of their stories on how the Skinwalkers were created instead of like the actual Skinwalker stories, because I wanted there to be different types of Skinwalkers in the Face Shifters, because normal Skinwalkers, according to the research I've done, they're all bad, like straight up evil. But I wanted some to be good, so I had to like get creative with it. But I like that there's an origin story for different creatures like that, and mine's urban fantasy based, so it's kind of gives readers more of an imaginative kind of worldview of it, I think.
I think there are probably times where sort of mysterious backgrounds is appropriate, but certainly I think when you think of all the sort of iconic, kind of paranormal figures out there, they do all have a story. I think what's also important is that while you have kind of species or types of entity, I think individuals have to be treated as characters with their own backstory too. So sometimes that can be twofold. We have to explain how the creature came to be. But if it's one of many, I think we also have to explain a particular antagonist, if that's important, and treat them all as characters and not just sort of mindless monsters.
I think for me, it also depends on whether I'm using something that's really well known or really not. If it's something obscure, then I absolutely need to kind of I have to give the reader some sort of understanding pretty early on, at least of maybe what it can do, like however it impacts the story when it first shows up. That has to make sense to the reader. But I think with fantastical entities and things that many readers are familiar with, like vampires or shifters or whatever, I think what's most important is to focus initially, like show what is different. For Javaja, the first book of my Soul Cavern series, I have a vampire-like creature, a humanoid, I guess you call them, but they're very different. And so those are like in the opening scene, like the main character is stung by one and they have stingers on the bottom of their tongue, which is in folklore from, I want to say, Slavic vampires. And so that's different. But also they're not actually vampires in what we understand them to be. They're not undead. They're not immortal. But that stuff comes later. But initially, they don't have fangs any more than a human being would have fangs. So, like, I think it's important because otherwise the reader's going to have the assumption that it's the same. Whereas if you focus on something that's different, they'll know that it's not the same.
I think in my work, I've played with both of these things, especially with the Blasphemer series. I started with asking myself questions to understand, and I'm a huge religious study nut. I love learning about different cultures and religions, and the biggest thing that always popped up for me was the Nephilim and how they were supposed to be giants among men. So I started asking myself things like, well, what would be considered, giant among men? And that's how I explained where everything from vampires to werewolves originally started, even witches. But then I've also done a short story called Human Ouija, which is about a man who is mourning the death of his wife. He was on the phone with her when she died, and there was nothing he could do. And he starts, dabbling in things he shouldn't. And there is an entity in it that I don't really explain, because he starts messing with a Ouija board. And he thinks that this thing can help him get to his wife or something, so he could at least say, I love you, I'm sorry I couldn't help you. So I've done both. I've done an in-depth background for really important things, but I've also just let something just be. Let the reader come up with the backstory for itself.
What exactly are some of the pet peeves or some of the tropes that you think just need to go the fuck away when it comes to paranormal?
Shifters, werewolves, however you have it. Of course, they will have a hierarchy with an alpha beta, but the fact that they are so misogynistic, possessive, I don't like that. I don't think that's right. And especially if you actually look at wolves in the wild that you are basing, their hierarchy on, it's wrong. That's not how alphas behave. And one of the quotes that I had just read, obviously by a human being, I'm not quoting, is a leader doesn't pull from the front, he pushes from behind. And that is how alphas behave in the real world. And that is how I would like to see them in fiction. And that is the reason in the Paige Papillon novels, in book 3, my werewolf character, that is the reason he left his pack, because they were too old-fashioned in their beliefs, and he believed in what was natural.
Agreed.
Clients are probably going to get upset with that, but that's okay. They know I don't like that trope, even though I work with them on it.
I mean, I like to read books like that just because, like, the steamy romance stuff. But, like, it is super annoying that the alphas are extremely possessive, pushy, and you're like, because, I mean, even though I write shifters, none of mine are really like that. Like, Ember takes control of her life. She's a hellhound, though, and she's kind of like wolf. They have wolf-like tendencies, but she also relies on her mates. And, like, even with my Face Shifter series, they're working together. It's not just like alpha is going to do all the things and you have to follow everything they say.
Anything that is harmful to women really bothers me. And the glamorization of, say, raping women until they love you, I've seen kind of that becoming a thing. And those sort of things, it's just, I just don't agree with it. I know that there are entities like succubus and incubus, and I know what they can do historically with myths and legends with that. But I've seen that as an uptick in a lot of writers doing that now. And, do what you're going to do as a writer. We're all playing in fantasy worlds, but something about that really rubs me the wrong way. I mean, we're having enough trouble as women anyways, especially in the US. So when I pick a book up and that's in there, it really bothers me. So I don't know if it is just paranormal or not paranormal, but it was something I've seen that is disturbing to me.
I think it hooks into the alpha tropes that you were talking about a minute ago, Lily, because I feel like it I mean, not always, obviously, but I feel like that can definitely happen in those genres and stuff.
It's one thing when writers are kind of unimaginative with a certain subject material, but I think it's worse when they're unimaginative in a way that wastes potential. For me, vampires are the biggest example of this. Vampires are everywhere now. Certainly, over the past few years in particular, there have been a lot of vampire stories, and I've noticed that it's always sort of, many 100-year-old immortals with super strength and heightened senses, and they're all kind of mid-20-year-old man frozen in that time. Someone could have been turned into a vampire at any stage in their life, and I want to see some variety, and I want to see a little old lady who is 700 years old and stronger than a gorilla. Vampires are inherently wild concepts. Be wild with it.
I have to say, I have seen, I can't remember the name of the story. It was a reverse harem romance paranormal thing. And a little old lady did get turned into a vampire. And I was just like, holy cow, this is so cool. Because it was extremely different. And it was the first time I'd come across like an older lady. She was like mated to these vampires, and they found each other and they turned her, and I was like, okay, she stayed a little old lady, but she was super strong. And I was like, okay.
In the paranormal,
I'm glad it has been done.
A 54-year-old man who gets turned into a vampire,
And
he's a 54-year-old man. That's usually old for urban fantasy even.
Yeah.
And the thing is if you get turned at a certain time, it will take you and keep you. You age 1 year for every 100, and it'll try and keep you at your optimum age. And for him, his optimum age was 45. He was still middle-aged. And that was important for me to write that because, like Lindsay said, it's not all, hot young guys or even hot young girls. That's not right. It's boring.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about ghosts. I think we got to get away from the little girl being the creepy little girl ghost. That drives me insane.
Yeah.
I'd read a vampire book where they were talking about how people used to train their whole lives to become vampires, so they're super strong and they're hunky, and the main character is a fat vampire. And I loved it because I'm like, that is so different than anything I've ever read before. And he got turned because he was going to die. And the kid that turned him, wasn't one of those beefy, heartthrob type vampires. Because I remember the cover was fangs biting into like a fried piece of chicken. And that's what got my attention because I'd never seen a cover like that before.
It's the most unoriginal title I've ever seen. It's called Fat Vampire.
Is it really?
There was also a cover for it that was like a Slurpee with bite meat.
It's a 6-book series.
Oh, it's by the guys from Sterling and Stone, the self-publishing podcast. That's Johnny Truant, and it's 3 guys who they write their books together. And along those lines, vampire fiction where it's a multi-100-year-old vampire falling in love with a 16-year-old girl. Dude. That is creepy as fuck, man. As a 50-something-year-old, I don't relate to 20-something-year-olds. So if there's a 400-year-old vampire that relates to a 16-year-old, I feel like there are other things that you could be exploring in that person.
It's the underage part that creeps me out.
Yeah, that
and
also,
see, like, if they're both going to be immortal, like, it kind of makes sense, like, the mate thing. But, like, if it's a human 15-year-old and, like, a centuries-old being, like, if that one died in a fire, I would dance around the fire naked, and I don't do that very often, so that tells me something.
And that's why I will never understand why vampires sparkle.
No, that was actually stolen and incorporated from Anne Rice. Where if you read Queen of the Damned, they don't sparkle. They wind up after their ancients for a certain time turn to like marble. That's where that idea was taken from. I mean, that hasn't been confirmed, but that's the consensus.
Stephanie Myers did not do a good interpretation of that.
Yeah, another thing I understand is she took that and put like Fey lore into it. It's like, yes, fairies sparkle, vampires don't. Please don't mix the two.
It is never a good sign when plagiarism is not the worst part of you.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Words That Kill, and today...
What is the balance to the thing that you're trying to introduce?
I know that the feeling. I had 2 gods go to war in one of my books, and I had to work on that scene a long time, so they just didn't basically destroy the entire world.
It's too easy to go about that. It's not as interesting if every novel ends with someone being burnt, to save someone else.
Technically, they didn't burn witches except in Germany, though. I'm just saying. They actually hung witches and then burned the bodies. That's where the fire comes in. What was her first kill like as an assassin, without spoilers?
What's the slowest way to die? What's the slowest way to bleed out? And that ended up being where he had to stab.
Okay, you're going to have to tell me that off camera. So